Beth, it's great to take some questions. Does anyone have any questions about? Sure. Please wait for the mic. I assume it's going to work its way over to you.
Melanie, good morning. I see you now. I heard Bill mention you. How are you? Yeah, greetings.
Thank you, Secretary. I
Yes,
wonder, I heard you mention energy independence.
Right.
Could you describe what that means to you? Is it important? And
Sure.
then how do we get there?
Well, I think it is. I think at some point, and of course, as Bill mentioned earlier, you know, if someone has an answer 20 years out, they probably already have the answer. But I'm a believer just in what I have seen in my lifetime and where we can go, where American ingenuity can take us. I think that over time that we can transition, and I don't know how long that timeline is, that many in the room would have a better idea than I. But over time, hopefully within my lifetime, hopefully I'll live to see it, but we can transition truly to an economy that is more efficient in the use of energy, particularly hydrocarbons, that reduces our need to use hydrocarbons for inefficient uses and in inefficient ways. That is a road to energy independence for our country, and it's a huge challenge, but it's one that the country is really dependent upon, in my view, from a security standpoint, both economic and military, as we mentioned. But those challenges are great because everyone has a timeline, and you see different predictions, but certainly throughout the rest of my life, at least, our country is going to need traditional hydrocarbons to not only sustain us, but to transition us to other forms of energy. And that's primarily oil, natural gas, and coal. We're already developing other energy sources, and many of you are involved in that. But it is, all of those require, at least in some element of their creation or use, hydrocarbons. And we are going to have to do that over time in technology. Will we ever be hydrocarbon free? Will the world ever be hydrocarbon free? I don't know. I can't imagine it, but there will always be a place for hydrocarbons. The question is will it be such a huge amount that we are too dependent on one source? And I think that as technology, it's already advanced us. As technology proceeds, that we will be less dependent on hydrocarbons.
I'd like to compliment the Secretary that although you talked about conventional hydrocarbons, you are doing a lot to break the artificial barrier we have erected around conventional hydrocarbons. And to illustrate this, I would like to make a controversial statement. We are not short of hydrocarbon molecules. We are short of the kinds that conveniently conform to a model that we have created. And as we get away from this model, like in ANWR, like in coal bed methane, we're going to unlock the hydrocarbons in tight carbonates, 70% of the world reserves, shales, tar sands, heavy oil, and I've not even mentioned hydrates yet.
Oh, absolutely.
So there is plenty of hydrocarbon molecules.
Sure. Understand that. My good friend, Dr. Charles Mankin, who back when I was in office in Oklahoma, he's the director of the Geological Survey, he used to always say, this is just one example, the state of Oklahoma since statehood has drilled 500,000 wells, and they have produced about 12 billion barrels of oil. He says there's another 12 billion down there to recover. But the easy, cheap 12 billion has been produced, and that's really the point you're making. Yes, I certainly think that what is going to happen is that over time, the market, the forces will make a lot of the new technology more affordable. There will be more items on the buffet table, if you will, from which to select in the terms of energy source. And that not only gives you more variety and more opportunity, but it also gives you a better competitive price because they all compete. Thank you.
Thank you. So Mr. Smith is so eloquent and precise that we have a little time for a 15-minute break. Bathrooms, coffee. So we'll meet here in 15 minutes. Yeah. All right. Who is the Special Assistant to the Chancellor of Science and Technology, University of California at Berkeley. And he is going to talk to us about the roots and the importance of the National Nanotechnology Initiative policy and challenges of independence.
Thanks.
Do I have that right? No, of implementation. Yes, there's the word.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
Good morning. Since one of the goals of this conference is to help lay the foundations for a major initiative in energy research and development, I thought that there might be some value in at least giving you my perspective on where national science and technology initiatives come from. From 93 to 2001, I worked for President Clinton in a part of the White House called the National Economic Council, and worked on putting together a number of these national science and technology initiatives. So I'd just like to say generally what usually needs to occur for these to get put together, to use the NNI as a case study, and then also to talk about what are some of the challenges associated with trying to increase federal support for research and development in the energy area. So first of all, what do I mean by a science and technology initiative? I'm talking about a targeted increase in funding in a particular area of science and technology, usually multi-agency, although clearly agencies also use the initiative process. It's a mechanism for the United States government to set priorities, and it's accompanied by both a rationale, why are we making this a priority, and a strategy, what do we want to do and how are we going to do it? Well, so why have these at all? I mean, if you talk to most people in the science and engineering community, their message is, give us 7% more money than you gave us last year. And the problem with that is that as someone who had to make the case for science and engineering to the political folks who run the country, that is a loser argument. Because by the time budget decisions get to the White House, people are weighing the allocation of scarce resources between concrete outcomes. They say, all right, well, the president has made a commitment, this is in the previous administration, to have 100,000 cops on the street, or to reduce class size by 25% in the early grades. And if you say, we should increase the budget of the Department of Energy Office of Science or the National Science Foundation by 7%, they have no idea what that means. So I found that that the typical approach of the science and engineering community, which is give us more money than you gave us last year, was not particularly effective in terms of increasing the government's investment in research and development. There are a number of other reasons why you might want to have these initiatives as well. It may help foster multidisciplinary research because the focus is generally on a problem or an outcome as opposed to a particular discipline. This notion of an across-the-board increase seems to abdicate responsibility for priority setting. And I also think it helps generate greater public understanding of the potential outcomes and payoffs. Now, having said that, there are definitely some risks associated with this initiative process. There's a lot of overhead associated with it. There's a lot of time and energy that's spent on developing and coordinating these multi-agency initiatives. You can have this sort of disease of the week phenomena in which politicians are responding to whatever seems to be hot and trendy. Clearly, there is always the risk that in the absence of more money for science and engineering generally, that initiatives could crowd out core research budgets. Certainly not all science and engineering research topics are going to support an initiative. And even after you've developed one of these, it's not clear that the congressional process always rewards this. Because remember, appropriations decisions are made by 13 different appropriations subcommittees. So you can have this elaborate initiative, define roles and responsibilities for a number of different agencies, and the Congress is like, well, who cares? I'm responsible for looking at the budget of agency X. So what are some examples of these multi-agency initiatives? An effort to increase funding for information technology research, and its predecessor initiative, which focused more specifically on high-performance computing, the NNI, the Climate Change Technology Initiative, Interagency Education Research Initiative, and Critical Infrastructure Protection, defending the nation's critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. So the first thing that you have to do is say, well, why are we doing this? Why should this be a priority? Why should we invest taxpayer dollars in this particular area? So that's the first step, is really to develop the rationale. And in R&D, as has been mentioned, there are a broad number of rationale that are generally used: economic growth and job creation, health, environment and sustainable development, national security, and more recently, homeland defense, expanding the science and technology workforce, allowing us to make better decisions in a particular area, new knowledge as an end in itself, and serendipity, which I think is an important rationale for curiosity-driven research, which I think is very important for the nation to continue to support, that is not linked to any particular outcome. And my favorite example of this is, one would not expect paleontology to have a huge number of practical applications. It seems to fall more in the category of the arts, something that we should fund just because of its intrinsic goodness. And in fact, it was paleontology that led to us thinking about near-Earth asteroids. And it seems to me that preventing the end of human civilization is something practical. So I think that although I'm going to talk about initiatives that have a more tangible outcomes and are more in what some people have called the Pasteur's quadrant, that is fundamental research that is motivated by a concrete societal outcome, I nevertheless think it is very important to continue to support curiosity-driven research. Well, the second question you have to answer is, why is a government role appropriate? And there are two usual answers that are given to this. First of all, that it's related to a mission of a particular government agency, such as defense, or the social rate of return is higher than the private rate of return. It may be the research may be too long-term or too risky or impossible for the private sector to capture some or all of the benefits. The next question is a favorite of OMB. Well, if this is so important, then why can't you do this by reprioritizing existing funds? What's the position of the U.S. relative to the rest of the world? Why now? So common answers to this is, well, we have some early promising results, or there's more good ideas than dollars, or there's new challenges or opportunities. And finally, what's the return on investment from past government expenditures in this area? So this was a very powerful and compelling justification to increase funding for long-term IT research, because we could say, well, in you have to remember this is in the late 90s. In 1969, government supported ARPANET, which led to today's internet. We think the ROI from that investment was pretty good. We should continue to support long-term information technology research. So after you've developed this, what is hopefully a compelling rationale for why we need to make this investment, then you have to say, all right, well, what would we do with the incremental resources? And the first thing is the goals. You know, can you identify a goal that can be stated succinctly as a grand challenge that is compelling and exciting? What are the ultimate payoffs to society if these goals are researched, if these goals are reached? And is it possible to quantify the goals? What's the research agenda? What are the research topics that are viewed as important and promising by the research community? Budget. How much is the government currently investing? I mean, if you go to the Office of Management Budget and say, we need to double our investment in, you know, area X, and they'll say, well, how much are we spending now? And if you don't know the answer to that, you're in trouble. So how do we know whether the research community can absorb the increases? This was a big problem in the area of education research. It was like the joke of, you know, Woody Allen with these two women who were saying, oh, the food here was terrible. And the other says, yes, and the portions are small too. And that's the problem that we have with education research is there's not very much of it, and a lot of what there is isn't very good. So it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in policymakers to expand funding in this area. Another question you have to ask is, what are the mechanisms of support? I mean, is this something that's going to be done primarily by individual PIs or small groups or centers? Is there a need to support research infrastructure or an IT component that might look at computational science or collaboratories? This is becoming increasingly important in science with things like the National Virtual Observatory for Astronomy, for example. There's an important distinction, I think is underappreciated in policy circles on the distinction between the strong program manager versus peer review. So if you compare one of the traditional science agencies versus a DARPA program manager is given a budget and they're empowered to make some vision of the future happen. Whereas in the more traditional science agencies, their job is to, I'm simplifying a little bit, but to take the applications that they have and send them out to a panel and sort of rack them and stack them, and then fund the ones that make it to some priorities score. And they're not really in a position to say, what's the portfolio of activities that I need to support in order to be able to make X happen? So I think in some of these areas of that are more in this Pasteur's quadrant category, I think the strong program manager model is very important. Education and training, ethical, legal, and social implications, technology transfer are all also important dimensions. Then there's the issue of, how are you going to manage and coordinate this? What's the division of labor between the agencies? Hopefully it's based on their different mission and their competencies. And you always run into this tension between trying to develop a national plan and agency autonomy and mission, because they say, well, at the end of the day, I'm ultimately accountable to my appropriator, and unless I can show how this relates to my mission, I'm not going to get funding for it. What are the linkages to non-R&D policy, which is a point I'm going to come back to because I think it's particularly germane in the energy area. What sort of partnerships do you want to form with industry, at the state level, international collaboration? And then what mechanism are you going to have for evaluation and input? And this is particularly important with new legislation like the Government Performance and Results Act, in which the Congress and the OMB is looking at metrics for relevance and quality and performance of research. So Some of this is going to overlap with some of the points that were made by Richard Russell, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a historical perspective on the NNI and where it came from. It was announced by President Clinton at a speech he gave in Caltech in January 2000, and certainly enjoyed bipartisan support from the Bush administration, and it resulted in funding going from $270 million in FY 2000 to $847 million in the 04 budget, with really an emphasis on university research. That's where the majority of the money is going. I don't need to go over this. This is something that Richard covered. So, you know, a lot of scientists and engineers wince when they see these types of things, but I think that this idea, so, you know, one of the things that I did was just to go around to different scientists and engineers and say, all right, if we increased funding for nanoscale science and engineering, what are some potential outcomes? What might come out of this? Now, you know, I recognize that this is not like, you know, many of the things on this list will be wrong, and many of the things that are not on this list will be the ones that ultimately are important. But it is important to be able to give the politicians that allocate resource some sense for what some of the potential outcomes are. And so these are some of the ones that we came up with. Storing the Library of Congress in a device the size of a sugar cube, being able to detect tumors when there are a few cells in size, making materials that are stronger than steel in a fraction of the weight, and being able to sequence the human genome in hours rather than months. And this is important because, again, policymakers had no idea what nanotechnology was, and you needed to be able, in a sort of a hallway conversation in the West Wing in about 2 minutes, be able to communicate why increasing funding in this area was a good thing. Then there was also an important effort that Rick Smalley and Stan Williams and a number of others contributed to, really to identify what the hardcore technical challenges were, understanding what the new properties of materials and devices were that are emerging at the nanoscale, being able to do ab initio design of new materials, controllable and tailorable synthesis and fabrication of nano building blocks. So we can make these wonderful carbon nanotubes, and some of them are metallic and some of them are semiconducting. And as far as I know, we don't have the ability to turn a knob and only get, you know, all metallic or all semiconducting at this point. Next year, okay. This whole nano-bio interaction, the convergence in length scales between biomolecules like DNA and proteins and the inorganic nanostructures that we can make is really fascinating. And a lot of interest in trying to figure out what we can learn from nature, how nature does energy conversion or hierarchical self-assembly or transduction or the sort of the combinatorial approach of our immune system. So that's one important. The other dimension is what can nano do for bio? So some great work at Berkeley and other places on the health and biology applications of semiconductor nanocrystals as a form of bioassay. And this last challenge is again something that is receiving a lot of attention at Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley, which is, well, it's great that we have these building blocks. We have these nanowires and nanodots and buckyballs, but it would be like if Intel came running up to you and said, look, here's an electron micrograph of a transistor. And you'd say, well, that's nice. Well, why don't you come back to me when you can make 400 million of them and figure out the I/O and the packaging. So this challenge of how we go from these building blocks that have these new properties to complex, functional, integrated nanosystems is really one of the areas that is being emphasized by researchers at Berkeley and the Molecular Foundry at Lawrence Berkeley, which is one of the centers that Richard Russell mentioned. So that's sort of what the goals were, a little bit of some of the dimensions of the research agenda as it was identified by the community. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how this was actually put together. So these are some of the things that needed to be done. First of all, the creation of a working group under the National Science and Technology Council to pull all the disparate agencies together, some workshops to develop the research agenda, global technology assessment that looked at where the United States was relative to Europe and Asia, developing the intellectual case, crosscut, which is just Washington jargon for figuring out how much the government is spending, and a detailed budget proposal and a rationale for specific levels of investment. So one of the things that really annoys OMB is if you come up with some arbitrary number. Like, oh, I don't know, I think we should, double what we're currently spending. And to which their answer is, well, why double? Why not, maybe we should be spending less. Maybe we should triple our budget. So that's another thing that we worked on. So in terms of the intellectual case, the real reason we did it was because we thought it would be cool. But we did develop an elaborate post hoc rationale for why we thought the NNI was important. First of all, we were persuaded that there were really huge and pervasive benefits that were on the par with other what economists call general purpose technologies. That is, things like electricity, the computer chip, the internet, that really wind up, they're not widgets that have an impact on one technology. They really have a wide and sweeping impact on all of our economy and our society. It met many niche needs. There was long-term fundamental research that was needed, which is beyond the time horizon of firms. One of the things that President Clinton said in his Caltech speech, which is often overlooked by the venture capitalists and those who organize conferences around this, is that some of the long-term potential of nanotechnology may take 20 years or more to realize, which is why there's an important role for the federal government. The interest in training the workforce of the 21st century, because first thing that happens when you give a professor a grant is they go out and hire a bunch of graduate students to do the work. So funding for university research is one way of generating the workforce of the 21st century. International leadership was clearly up for grabs. The United States was not entering this area with any particular advantage. We also saw it as a way of addressing the imbalance between biomedical research and the physical sciences and engineering. NIH budget had doubled. Support for the physical sciences and engineering had been flat or even down in real terms. And we were not going to get more money by saying, we need to spend more money on condensed matter physics. But the NNI wound up supporting a lot of research in chemistry and physics and engineering and material science. The agencies were only able to fund a fraction of the meritorious proposals that were coming in. So even after NSF did something called limited submission, where they tell the universities, we don't care how many good ideas you have, you can only give us 2. They were still only able to fund 12% of the proposals that were coming in. So that was an indication that there was a lot of grassroots interest in the research community. And finally, this is something that Dr. Smalley brought to our attention, of this notion that nanotechnology could be a way to get young boys and girls excited about science and engineering, because the idea of being able to put atoms where you want them is just cool. So in terms of the internal advocacy, first of all, we needed to convince the agencies to request the money in their budget. We needed to get OMB on board early, because their role in life is to say no, and it's a very important role. But their sort of general first reaction is no, you can't. We needed to get the senior White House staff educated and excited about nano, and fortunately, Neil Lane, the president's science advisor, was a very effective and eloquent advocate for the initiative. We need to cope with some of the agency-specific issues. Let me give you one example. We thought that DoD had an important role to play in this initiative because of DARPA, for example, was supporting some very important work in molecular electronics. That turns out to be very difficult to engineer because the people who run, R&D is really not on the priority list for DoD as an institution. Procurement, military pay, pensions, operational tempo. I mean, you've got to go very far down the list before they say, oh yeah, 6162. I had to get the chief of staff to call the deputy secretary of defense and saying, we're going to give you some additional money for nanotechnology, because there was no way that the R&D part of DoD could request that. And then we also had, obviously, the president did an event on this and also mentioned it in the State of the Union. And people, I think, underappreciate the impact that this has. I mean, after working in the White House for 8 years, I think sometimes the ability of the president to shape the national agenda, indeed the global agenda, simply by virtue of what they talk about, is sometimes a lot more important than any specific policy or budgetary measure that they propose. Because as soon as the president started talking about nanotechnology, the next year, virtually every governor said, and we're going to become Nanotechnology Valley, and then in short order, all of the other countries, major industrialized countries, announced major nanotechnology initiatives. So, in fact, I'm worried that they're now increasing their funding at a much more rapid rate than we are. So, anyway, be careful what you ask for. There was a lot of important external advocacy. Chuck Vest, president of MIT, led a panel that Dr. Smalley served on that did sort of a quick evaluation of the initiative. We had a lot of endorsements from CEOs. We had a lot of very positive media coverage for the initiative. This was before the Bill Joy article came out, and my boss, who doesn't normally read Wired, saw this story in the Washington Post that's talked about Bill Joy saying that this is going to lead to we're going to have self-assembling nanobots, and so he said, so let me get this straight, Khalil. By hiring you, I am the proximate cause of the end of human civilization. I said, that's right. So in terms of the timeline, you started to have grassroots meetings at the program manager level, starting in sort of in the 96 time frame. 98, we formed this working group of the NSTC. We had some workshops to get input from the research community in 99, and by 2000, the president had given a speech on the NNI, and we were off to the races. So there was definitely a favorable environment for the NNI. We had budget surpluses. There was a growing concern about balance in the S&T portfolio, the imbalance between biomedical research and the physical sciences and engineering. You had a high level of presidential and interest by the vice president in science and technology, and a clear connection between technology and economic growth in 99 and 2000. We were still in the new economy era. So some of the lessons that I learned from this was it's very important to start with a big idea that captures people's imagination. You need to have entrepreneurs, some with political skills, but some with technical depth. So, I think we had a really unique partnership between people in the White House and the National Economic Council, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, but also a bunch of really hardworking program managers, people like Mike Rocco at NSF and Jim Murday at ONR, and all of the people in the research community who pulled together and helped make this happen. And then you also need to understand the multiple audiences, actors, and agencies that need to say yes in order to make something like this happen, and understand the different things that they respond to. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about what I see as some of the challenges to a major initiative in energy research and development. If you look at the trends in applied energy technology R&D, which I realize does not cover the entire landscape, but you're talking about efficiency, fission, fossil, fusion, renewables, that has declined from $6 billion in FY97 to $1.3 billion in 97. So it's gone down by more than a factor of 4. There was a PCAST report that John Holdren led that led to a slight increase, but now it looks like we're back down to about 1.3 billion again. So it's sort of like Sisyphus trying to roll this rock up the hill only to see it go down. Having said that, as you heard from Richard, you do have some administration interest in the Freedom Car and hydrogen, the transition to a hydrogen economy. So these are, as someone who's, I'm an outsider in this area. I don't claim to have any expertise in the energy area. But as an outsider looking at this policy area, these are what I see as some of the challenges. First of all, you have the experience of things like Synfuels and Clinch River breeder reactor, which were not viewed as huge successes. You've got low energy prices, so no real sense of urgency. There are clearly long timescales associated with developing new options compared to the short duration of energy crises. So you can get people to focus on energy as an issue for maybe a year or two when you have a price increase, and then attention usually goes down after that. As John Holdren points out, you've got internal warfare among the advocates of different energy solutions, so they form a firing squad and shoot inward at each other. By virtue of the way that the congressional appropriations process works, energy R&D has to compete with water projects, and I'm sure Ernie could tell some stories about that. Most of the compelling reasons for new energy sources are based on what economists call externalities. That is, that the price of energy is not, the cost of energy is not reflected in its price. So things like climate change and air quality and energy security. Now we have $400 billion budget deficits. That's according to the Goldman Sachs latest estimate. So clearly that is going to have an impact on trying to get funding for things that are on the civilian side and not related to homeland defense. You also have to confront this sort of inherent skepticism of many, not all, but many economists. And I think it's important to talk to people who disagree with you, because I think it sharpens your argument, so that you shouldn't, convene groups of the faithful and sort of preach to the choir, but, talk to people who violently disagree with you. So there's skepticism of government-funded R&D as it gets closer to applied research. Many don't really buy energy security as a rationale. They say, well, people can hedge, they can, they can participate in futures markets or something like that. And anyway, we're affected by the global price of energy, so what does it matter what our oil import ratio is? They say, well, rather than doing R&D, why don't we just rely on market-oriented mechanisms like emissions fees or cap and trade, that type of thing. And they might agree with you that there may be some market failures, but they would say, well, the risk of a government failure may be larger than the risk of the market failure. So even if there is a market failure, that's not a prima facie case for doing something about it. This is the advice of one prominent pollster. I won't tell you which party he works for. You have to guess. Should the public come to believe that scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. You'll need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. So that's the advice that at least one large political party in the United States is getting on this issue. So, so I'm not saying that you should give up. I mean, I do think there are some reasons for optimism, and I think it is too important an area. So these are some of the reasons why I think that there is an opportunity for, assuming that you had some presidential leadership in this area. First of all, I think that cleaner sources of energy is clearly a big man-on-the-moon class goal. I think the notion that we would, if we wanted to stabilize global warming at 2 degrees centigrade by 2050, that means that we would have to have the equivalent of a carbon-free power plant every day between now and the year 2050 is clearly not something we know how to do now, and I think is the sort of big goal that you could get the American people excited about. Although the reasons for doing this are not solely related to global warming, I think that is one of the rationales for this, and nearly 80% of Americans believe that, global warming is a problem. And you even have a growing number of businesses acknowledging that climate change is, quote, one of our most serious challenges. R&D is a relatively non-controversial component of energy policy. I mean, relative to saying, we ought to have a big whopping BTU tax or a big gas tax, I think saying that we should spend more money on R&D is relatively non-controversial. And I think people see some of the added benefits of energy efficiency and clean energy. The way businesses are looking at this is to say, hey, we think that if we're more energy efficient, that also means that we're going to be more productive. And so that's why you have a number of companies sort of getting on this sustainable development bandwagon, because they don't see a conflict between the goals of sustainable development and the goals of being more competitive. And finally, there's also huge export and growth potential associated with these new energy technologies. And the United States should lead in these areas. So having pointed out some of the challenges, I still nevertheless think that there are some of the latent conditions that would allow a president to rally the country behind this goal. And I think that the work that you are doing to define the research agenda is a very important first step to making this happen. Thank you very much. Yep.
Any questions? Yorm?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. I may put you in a tough spot a little bit, but when I heard about the hydrogen initiative, on one hand, of course, I liked it. Mm-hmm. But then I said, why? Of all the urgent things that we need to do in the general global energy economy, that's only one of the very important problems. Mm-hmm. And as the Secretary pointed out, hydrogen is not really a fuel. Mm-hmm. It's a method to carry energy, because you have to make it. Practically all the hydrogen in nature is bonded. So why hydrogen? Second question is, what other initiatives, nano initiatives, are, since you pointed out that the global leadership is still at large, what other initiatives are competing with us, especially if you can comment about the Chinese initiative?
Well, on the first question, I think is more appropriately directed at someone from the current administration rather than the previous administration. The second question is that there are a bunch of other governments that are significantly ramping up their funding on nanotechnology. And I think at one point Japan was spending more in absolute dollars than we were, even though their economy is 1/3 our size. I think that with respect to China, they're spending a lot, but I think the other big issue is I think around 35 to 40% of their bachelors are in engineering. And when you compare that with what's going on in the United States, I'm talking to more and more companies that are shifting, not just low-cost manufacturing, but R&D, high-level design, because they can say, they just have so many more, and they're available for a fraction of the cost. So I think that is a really important issue that really needs to be addressed.
Tom, one of the you didn't mention a challenge that I saw at DOE in R&D, and that's trying to run research programs on an annual appropriations basis. And wondering if you had any thoughts on how we might change that, because I think it really perverts some of certainly the DOE energy R&D programs.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. One is I do think that getting legislation which authorizes these initiatives on a multi-year basis is of some value. It's neither necessary nor sufficient, but I think it does help. I think the other thing that's important is for agencies to, in some of these areas, try to increase the duration of grants. So you see Rita Caldwell at NSF, for example, saying, our average grant size is $100,000 a year, and the grants last for 3 years. So it's very difficult to change the world on $100,000. And if faculty are spending all their time writing grants, that's also not the most productive use of their time. So I think more consideration has to be given to intermediate grants that are in between the small individual PI grant that NSF has been doling out and the $5 million a year center grant. I think there's an intermediate point of that's more like $1 million a year for a couple PIs and their graduate students, but lasts for 5 years, so that the faculty are not always having to be in the business of writing grants. Stan? Yes. For those of you who are interested in more information on this, you can go to www.nano.gov. www.nano.gov. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the arguments of economists on innovation, because I hear them all the time. There is, and there actually are people who believe that the way you get technological innovation is through the normal operation of the market and the companies who invest in new technologies, and that's what creates things. But if you actually look at the last 50 years, and you look at the important technology, commercial aviation, gas turbines, radar, lasers, microelectronics, integrated circuits, satellite telecommunications, and of course the internet, which has been touted as driving the world economy. All of that stuff would never have happened without massive amounts of government R&D. Most of it motivated probably by fear in military R&D. I mean, operating on some level that isn't even conscious. And I always worry about this because we have all these rational arguments for how we do things, and the economists tell us that it's always the workings of the market. I wonder if that has anything to do with the way technology actually gets developed.
Well, you know, I agree with you that government funding is very important for fundamental and basic research. And clearly, if you go back and you look at the genesis of any technology, many times you'll see that government funding played a key role. I think the point they would make is that at some point, the amount that companies have to invest to actually commercialize that technology, to reduce it to practice, and make incremental improvements to it, swamps what the government invested. And so if you don't, so two things. One is economists get progressively more worried and twitchy as you get closer to something that looks like product development. And the second thing is that they say is that it's equally important, they would probably say more important, to get the prices right, to make sure that energy prices reflect true costs, including some of these negative externalities, than all the government programs in the world.
So I wanted to build on that a little bit. Marvin Keshner from Hewlett-Packard Corporation. What we find is extremely difficult. We spend $4 billion a year on R&D. It is extremely difficult to do very early work where the risk is high and the market is uncertain. So the examples just mentioned, the beginnings of airplanes and all kinds of things like that, are very difficult for companies to invest in. It has been tremendously advantageous to get help in that early phase. And then I agree, the commercialization, which is probably 10 times more money than the early phase, is something that companies can undertake quite well.
Right.
I think we can all say that this has been a marvelous work that you all have accomplished so far, and I'm looking forward to more. But the question I have now, I did not hear you say anything about considering the implications of the detrimental side, in other words, the problems that might come about. Is there anything being done to study that aspect?
Yeah, actually here at Rice, one of the NSF centers is looking at some of the environmental implications and human health effects of nanoparticles. Vicki Colvin, is that? And I think she would agree with you that more needs to be done to look at that particular issue, because we certainly don't want to have nanostructures viewed as the next asbestos, and I think it's important to look at these issues when they're still at the research stage as opposed to waiting until they're in widespread manufacturing. So yes, I think it's very important that research programs have a component that is looking at the ethical, legal, and social implications. And I think a useful model for that was 5% of the Human Genome Project has been allocated to this area, and looking at things like the potential for discrimination based on genetic information, that type of thing.
You spoke to John Holbrook's concern that the energy research community circles the wagons and shoots inwards. In the nanotech problem, were you successful in getting folks who looked at it from different angles, wet and dry, for example, to work together in advocating for it?
Yeah, because because I think importantly we were saying we're going to spend more money on this. So it was not seen as sort of this zero-sum game in which different factions, top-down versus bottom-up, wet versus dry, had to, duke it out for a share of the pie. I think the second thing is that intellectually, most people who've looked at this believe that it's going to require a combination of approaches, that it's going to require, inorganic chemistry, organic chemistry, top-down lithography, self-assembly that is either uses DNA or is inspired by nature, that type of thing. So I don't, the field is too new for it to have formed any kind of, rigid factions. Okay, thank you all very much.
Lunch is served in the Rice Memorial Center, which is, if you go out this door, it's just right across the street. And we convene back here at 1 o'clock.
The session, or you
yes. Why don't you start the session, and then after you're done, then I'll come up and I'll start introducing the speakers.
Okay. Do you want me to? So you don't need me to go through these
you don't need to do that.
These intros. You'll
if everybody could please grab their seats, we're about to start the program. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome back from the lunch for our afternoon session. I'm Steve Corral, and I'm a professor here at Rice and the founding director of the Rice Alliance for Technology and Entrepreneurship, which is one of your hosting organizations. We're delighted to have you back for the afternoon session. We've got a terrific lineup of speakers for you who will generally be talking about America's energy future. So we think this is going to be a terrific session, and my job is to welcome you and tell you a little bit about what we're doing at Rice and with the Rice Alliance, and then turn over to our speakers. So just a few words about the Rice Alliance for Technology and Entrepreneurship. This is a Rice University Center that is a joint partnership of the Jones Graduate School of Management, the Brown School of Engineering, and the Weiss School of Natural Sciences. And as I will explain in more detail in just a moment, our mission is to promote the commercialization of new technologies being developed in the Houston region. Well, so this morning we had Rick Smalley talking about his very bold vision concerning energy and new technologies such as nanotechnology. And clearly for the world's energy industry, nanotechnology will be perhaps the most critical source of new innovations. And I'm hopeful that energy firms, both here in Houston and around the world, really recognize this opportunity that nanotechnology is presenting. In fact, I think this is the most promising source of new products in the petrochemical area. Now, we're also getting some help from the U.S. government in terms of these innovations as well. They are aiming to, the Senate, in fact, is aiming to fund energy-related nanotechnology research through the Department of Energy, and has been doing already up to this point. But yesterday it was announced that the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee will send to the Senate floor on Monday a comprehensive energy policy bill, which would increase the Department of Energy's Office of Science allocation steadily over the next several years, resulting in a total funding of $5.4 billion in 2008. So we're very encouraged about that. And most importantly, for our purposes here today, the bill includes a provision for funding nanoscale science and engineering within the Department of Energy programs. Now, the passage of this bill is anything but certain, as is the case with any legislation, but we're particularly pleased to hear about this inclusion of nanotechnology in this new energy policy that the Senate has produced. Now, as I'll say more in a minute, Houston is particularly well positioned to be the hub of the convergence of the energy industry and nanotechnology. And in fact, last night I was at a dinner with one of Rice's most prominent nanotechnology researchers, and he remarked that the commercialization of nanotechnology basically boils down to chemical engineering. And fortunately here in Houston, we have 13 times the per capita average of chemical engineers in Houston. So the place is crawling with them. And so that positions us well in terms of the workforce to begin to consider the convergence of nanotechnology and the energy industry. So let me tell you a little bit about what I would like to talk about very briefly this afternoon. That is technology and economic development, and say a little bit about what we're doing here at Rice in terms of our programs to foster the creation of new nanotechnology startup companies. First of all, why should we emphasize entrepreneurship? Well, there are a number of reasons why entrepreneurship is critical to the convergence of energy and nanotechnology. But one is that breakthrough technologies in energy, and has been the case in many other sectors like biotech, are often best developed by small groups of highly skilled, risk-taking individuals. So it takes these small companies, in addition to the large energy companies, to create an industrial ecosystem, if you will, of people with different skills, different market areas of focus, and so on, to really begin to push the new nanotechnology industry forward. And another reason why we're emphasizing nanotechnology, entrepreneurship in nanotechnology, is that many students in fields relating to energy, such as chemistry, will be employed in startup companies. For example, the American Chemical Society data showed that approximately 50% of doctoral students in chemistry going to the for-profit sector actually take jobs in companies of 50 or fewer employees. So these are just two of many reasons that we are focusing on entrepreneurship and nanotechnology. Now let me step back just a little bit and provide some history. The research literature in economic geography has shown that geographical clusters of high-tech firms really require three ingredients. One is entrepreneurship infrastructure organizations, investment funding such as venture capital, and universities as catalysts. And that's what I want to focus on just for a moment now, this idea of university as catalysts. Now, of course, there are a lot of success stories here. Of course, Silicon Valley is very much the story of the role of Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley. In the Boston's Route 128 area, MIT technology and people have been critical in propelling that industry cluster. In the Research Triangle in North Carolina, the three main universities there in the state of North Carolina have been fundamental, and of course in Austin, the University of Texas has played a major role. And so through the Rice Alliance for Technology and Entrepreneurship, we're seeking to play this catalyst role here in Houston. So one of our aims is to bring together a series of stakeholder groups, such as, moving counterclockwise, Rice faculty and administration, current students, Rice alumni, the venture capital and investment community, other entrepreneurship infrastructure organizations such as the Houston Technology Center, members of larger businesses in the energy sector or information technology and so on, and in life science, the medical center here. And we have very strong relations with the institutions in the medical center. So again, our idea through the Rice Alliance is to play this catalyst role and bring together these different stakeholder groups that don't normally interact. And so that's the first step for us. So our mission is fairly straightforward. Again, to create a forum for exchange among the science, engineering, and entrepreneurship communities. And our goal is to develop and actively facilitate team-based approaches to the study and creation of new entrepreneurial business concepts, new jobs, new sources of wealth for Rice and the U.S. economy and for the Houston area, of course. Now, among these, perhaps one of the most important features is job creation. And of course, that's very much in the news. In fact, the unemployment rate is just inched up a bit to 6%, as was announced yesterday. So job creation is very much fundamental to policy issues, and very much has been fundamental to the Rice Alliance from its very beginning. So what is it that we actually do to promote technology commercialization? We have a close working relationship with the Office of Technology Transfer here at Rice, as well as other institutions in the area. And so it's the Office of Technology Transfer that is essentially the net that catches new science and engineering innovations. So those are disclosed to the Office of Technology Transfer by the inventors of new technology. And so here our innovations enter the pipeline, if you will, on the left-hand side. And that's how we find out what the new technologies are. In the second segment here, we have a number of activities to promote the formation of interdisciplinary teams of people who have technical backgrounds, as well as folks with business and management talent, as well as folks in the financial community. So we have networking events that we hold in the Rice Alliance. In fact, we've held a couple right in this room, where we try to bring together these different stakeholder groups. The middle segment is where our education piece is. So through the Jones School, as well as in the schools of science and engineering, we have a number of courses to teach technology entrepreneurship, both to MBAs as well as undergraduate and graduate students here at Rice. And so that's the education piece, and that's where we really try to provide some instruction on how to do a market analysis, how to understand, for example, new market opportunities for the convergence of energy and nanotechnology, and so on. And we also have a business thought leader speaker series that we use to bring in non-university folks to give a real-world perspective on these issues as well. And I'll say more about education in just a minute. So in the fourth segment here of our model, we have a system in place that allows us to get feedback from experienced entrepreneurs and folks in the venture community for the ideas that are being developed here at Rice and in the other Houston area institutions of higher education. And perhaps most important in this element of our program is the Southwest Business Plan competition, which is a regional competition with a national reach. So we just held this event about 4 weeks ago, and we were very pleased to have 28 universities send graduate student teams to participate in this business plan competition. We had about a third of the top 30 business schools send teams. We had a team from India come in just for the competition, and we had one team from Toronto. And I think that was before the SARS scare got really heated up in Toronto. So at least we hope they didn't bring it here. But we're very pleased with that event. We had a total of 88 judges participate. These are leaders in the high-tech and investment community. So this is a way that we allow the new ideas that are being created in institutions of higher education to get feedback and to get coaching and mentoring from folks in the investment community and the entrepreneurship community who have actually done this, started companies and run them successfully. Our final segment of the pipeline there is additional support that we provide to the startup companies that have come through the Rice Alliance. We help them find additional technical or management talent, and basically that is the scope of the Rice Alliance. So we are not an incubator, if you will. We don't have any seed funds. We're a part of the university trying to provide a service to the community, to the Southeast Texas community. And let me give you a little bit more information on what we've been up to, coming back to the education issue. So we have an annual technology entrepreneurship workshop that we hold every October, and we'll hold it again this coming year. And we feel like this is very, very fundamental to our purpose, because what we try to do is to educate the technical community, the scientists and engineers, about the process of forming their own company or being a part of a startup company. So very important that they have some sense of what this process is. And one reason why that is so important is because that if they are well educated about this process, they can be a better partner with folks in the investment community and folks from the business community, and they can play the appropriate role. So as I said, we try to equip them with knowledge of the process of company formation. We explain what are the appropriate roles for technical founders in a company, scientists and engineers. Usually that's not part of being the management team. It might be as a board member or as a scientific advisory board member and so on. But it's very important for us to educate the technical community about what is an appropriate role for a technical person in a startup company. And this is so important because, as I said a moment ago, it promotes proper interactions between researchers, academic researchers, and members of the investment community. Our flagship event is called a Technology Innovation Forum event. It's open to the public. In fact, we'd love to have all of you attend our events. And I know I see a number of familiar faces out there. Some of you have attended our events. So again, it's the idea of the forum events is to promote this exchange between the different stakeholder groups. The format for the events are we have a keynote speaker who is usually an experienced entrepreneur or a member of the investment community, and then we have 5 new businesses present. And we do it very quickly. They get 10 minutes to present, 5 minutes of Q&A, and then we go on to the next one. At the end of that part of the program, we have a feedback panel where we invite experienced entrepreneurs and others to give feedback to the presenters and coach them a bit on what they did well and what they could do better. So we feel like this is a very unique aspect of our educational program to give feedback, and of course this feedback is given in front of an audience of about this size, 200 or 300 people. So the presenters have to have a bit of a thick skin because they get very candid feedback in front of a large group of people. But we find it's really terrific from an educational standpoint. And we urge folks from all kinds of different occupations and areas to come to these events, such as service providers and so on. And we've been very much involved in helping to commercialize nanotechnology startups. We've actually had 115 companies come through this process since we started 3 years ago. Here are some examples of firms that we've provided some assistance to in the formation. These are all out of Rice, but we're not focused solely on Rice technologies. These just happen to be nanotechnology companies that we've helped start and get off the ground. Molecular electronics, of course, is an electronics application of nanotechnology. Nanospectra is a life science application. Oxane Materials is a filtration and environmental application of nanotechnology, and perhaps our biggest success story in terms of money raised is Carbon Nanotechnologies Incorporated, which is Rick Smalley's company. So not only does Rick win a Nobel Prize, he actually starts companies, so he is multi-talented indeed. Just to sum up, I want to leave you with the idea that Houston really can be a wonderful hub of the convergence of the energy industry and nanotechnology, and we have a number of events to try to promote this convergence here in Houston. We have an annual Technology Innovation Forum event on nanotechnology. We just did one in late January of this year, and we'll have another one in January of next year. We have an annual Nano Days conference put on by the Center for Biological and Environmental Nanotechnology. We are contemplating an Energy Innovation Forum in the fall. That'll be a forum, as I described just a minute ago, focused just on energy. And lastly, to find out more about these activities, there is the URL for our website. We'd love to have you all join in our activities at the Rice Alliance and contribute as an attendee or perhaps as a presenter. So we think that it's very important to have a focus on entrepreneurship in terms of nanotechnology. We think that this is a terrific way to create jobs and create wealth, and so that is the part that we are trying to play in the broader scheme of things. So I will now turn over to Amy Jaffe, who will discuss the upcoming speakers for this session. Amy?
Thanks very much, Steve. We have a great afternoon planned for you all. The next 4 speakers are people who have really led the way in how we think about energy in this country and abroad. They are all very respected people who are called in by heads of state and senior leaders here in the United States. And each one has been selected because of the unique perspective they provide on a particular topic. And so I'm going to begin with introducing to you Matthew Simmons. Matt is the chairman of Simmons & Company International, which is a very respected energy investment banking firm. His CV of charitable and public volunteer activities is so long that I would be taking up too much of his speaking slot to list them. But all of us that know Matt appreciate the incredible donation of time he's made to many, many causes, including here at Rice University. And so really it's a great honor to welcome him here today.
Thank you, Amy. First of all, let me congratulate the planners of this program today and congratulate the Baker Institute for making such an incredible mark on the world in such a short period of time. I'm not a scientist, and there are a lot of esteemed scientists in this room today, but I am a serious energy analyst, and I've been doing this for 35 years. And so let me begin by underscoring what this morning's speakers said. First of all, Dr. Smalley's beginning, that energy is important. There is no other element on Earth that is more important than energy. It's not a chicken and egg, as Rick Smalley so clearly said, because without energy, all of the other eggs don't occur. Secondly, fossil fuels have been the miracle of the 20th century. Without fossil fuels, virtually any of the things that we thought were so fabulous about the 20th century wouldn't have happened. Third, for the foreseeable future, fossil fuels, whether you like them or not, have got to anchor our future of energy. And then fourth, the population of the world will grow unless there's a catastrophic event. And the reason it will grow is you just look at the numbers. In 1890, the world had 1.5 billion people. It took 60 years to add another billion people. It took 30 years to add 2 billion people. And it took 20 years to add the last 1.5 billion people, which were the same amount of people that were on Earth in 1890. And so today we probably have around 5 billion people that are basically are parent age or yet to become parent age. So when we think about the future of energy, the idea that somehow or another the population shrinks, if it shrinks, it's a catastrophe. And so energy just could not be more important. And so what I would like to do in my time today is basically focus on the 2 primary fossil fuel energies that have made the life so wonderful for us, oil and gas, the challenges of these, and then raise the question, are we sure this miracle can continue? There's no question that throughout the 20th century, oil and gas anchored not only the energy mix, but basically all of our great things that we had. Ironically, while oil was discovered centuries ago by Seeps, and Colonel Drake discovered oil in the United States before the Civil War, it was really Spindletop in 1901 that created an oil well that was big enough to finally become a big source of energy. And ironically, had it not been for the next invention, the internal combustion engine, we might have spent the first 20 years wondering what on earth we would do with all the energy that Spindletop created. And as Rick Smalley then said eloquently this morning, it turned out that throughout the 20th century, it was basically the miracle of oil that did all the good and all the bad things of the 20th century. Wars were fought, economies were built, constructions of roads and ways to get there resulted in collections of nations versus villages, and then finally the airplanes created what we now today call globalization. Ironically, for the better half, or almost the majority of the 20th century, the better half of the hydrocarbon molecule, natural gas, was sort of the bastard child. And for most of the century, natural gas was merely a waste product. But luckily, as the century came to an end, natural gas finally took center stage. It should have done years ago. Along the way, oil and gas became a very large and critical industry. From tiny acorns, large trees are born. It's interesting that the oil and gas industry was still, in no question, in the United States and the globe, a cottage industry in 1921. We barely used gas, and we used a grand total of about 2 million barrels a day. By the end of World War II, we were using 7 million barrels a day of oil. By 1960, we were using 20 million barrels a day of oil. By 1970, we were using almost 50 million barrels a day of oil. By 2001, the world's using 75 million barrels a day of oil and 46 million barrels of oil equivalent per day of natural gas. And these two together, 122 million barrels a day, comprise 60% of a $3 trillion energy business, largest industry on earth, 1.8 trillion oil and gas. It's no longer a localized business. Over 50 countries today produce oil, and 45 countries produce gas. But core production is still highly skewed to a number of fields. It turns out we have over 5,000 named oil fields and 20,000 total oil fields in the world, and yet the 14 top oil fields in production today still account for 20% of our global supply. And it turns out that of the 43 countries that produce natural gas, 2, the United States and Russia, contribute 50% of total supply. So unquestionably, the oil and gas were a miracle. Well, the question becomes twofold. Does the miracle need to grow? And secondly, could it ever fade? Well, the creation of oil and gas miracle anchored the greatest century on earth. But the 21st century needs far more oil and gas. Population, as I said earlier, is just starting to bloom. And current oil and gas use, as astonishing as it is still limited to a chosen few. It turns out that only 55% of the world's energy is used by basically 12% of the people. The United States, 3% of the people, use almost 25% of the total energy. And sadly enough, there's still 2 billion people on Earth that have no access at all today to modern energy, and another 2 billion people that barely use any at all. Most planners assume this miracle has limitless growth. And in fact, no credible global plan has ever envisioned the miracle ever fading. But non-renewable is a real vocabulary word, and non-renewable energy will finally be used up. The question merely hangs on the date. And the key date is not when oil and gas is used up, because that, in fact, will be years and years and years and maybe even centuries. So the key date is when will it peak? Interestingly enough, with all the technology that we've developed in the world today and all the technology we've applied to energy, the technology to assess remaining energy resources is, in fact, hazy. There are various agencies that are constantly churning out with serious degree of analysis estimates on what are the remaining resources that we have today. Remaining resources being what we've discovered and haven't yet used and what we've yet to discover. But the process is hazy at best. It turns out that the ability to detect hydrocarbon presence, absent doing seismic work, is still 1901 vintage technology. The same techniques that Lord Cowdery used as he took a train between San Antonio and Mexico City and said, "Aren't those hills anticline?" And the young petroleum geologist, Mr. de Gollier, said, "They sure look like it." And by the time he got to Mexico City, he had formed what became Pemex. Is the same technique we use today. Seismic has made revolutionary strides, but even with the state-of-the-art 3D seismic, we still drill dry holes, and at very high rates. In the Gulf of Mexico today, on the shelf, in the shallowest water, when we started drilling 50 years ago, we're now finally starting to go down and drill below 15,000 feet. What we're finding there is fabulous when we find it. The success rate, 15%. And even mature basin resource estimates turn out to be very hazy guesses. Dr. Smalley and I spent the day together a week from last Monday in Washington at the National Research Council talking about the outlook for natural gas. And the head of our USGS gave an interesting example. He said that at a workshop they recently did, they took a mature basin in Argentina with about 230 producing fields and gave all of the people there all the data sets that would be needed to use all 7 of the technologies we have to assess what's left. The range of estimates was somewhere between 600 million and 17 billion barrels. We had another speaker that basically talked about the Green River Basin tight gas sands. And he said after 2 years of extensive study, it turns out, in his opinion, that everything we thought about tight gas sands probably isn't. And in fact, we probably have overstated our resources 3 to 5 times. And we had actually a fairly nasty debate between 2 of these scientists about whether he could have been right or whether he wasn't right. And then we had an interesting event in Sable Island off eastern Canada, one of the really miracle sources of natural gas supply. It turns out that once they drilled their 6th well, they basically had to reduce their proven reserves by 37%. Because by the 6th well, they realized that their estimates were just beyond the boundaries of the field. And so what we know today isn't quite as much as what sometimes we assume we know. Over the last decade, the energy industry's mantra was in fact a giddiness of ample oil and gas. And in fact, the biggest energy worry most energy planners had over the past decades was how to manage an energy glut. The oil-filled technology revolution was thought to have created a cornucopia of energy. The cornucopia went as follows. We have access to places we never went before. Cost reductions will soon resemble a semiconductor experience. History is finally leaving no barrel behind, and dry holes are becoming obsolete. All the major oil and gas companies, publicly traded, suddenly discovered they were going to grow their production by 6 to 8% per annum. And the worry was, what would we do with all this oil and gas? And prices would obviously fall, and OPEC had better cut back, unless, in fact, maybe even OPEC's days are over. And it turned out that the technology revolution was real. Its impact, though, was misunderstood. Once the cheering faded, few companies grew their production. They spent a fortune to keep production flat. It turns out that between 1996 and 2000, 145 best-in-class publicly traded companies, every name you know, spent $410 billion on their exploration and production costs, and their net production declined from 30 million barrels a day to 29.5. Turns out the big 5, Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, Texaco, and Total Fina Elf, between 1999 and 2002 spent $150 billion on E&P costs incurred, and their daily production went 16.1, 16.3, 16.5, 16.7. 600,000 barrel a day increase for $150 billion. Dry holes stayed high when exploration was done, and cost decreases were often illusionary. A greater and greater percentage of costs were enabled to be capitalized, and fuzzy reserve estimates then drove down DD&A, and producing sands all at once amortized costs by large volumes. This is a complicated slide, and it's only some numbers I made up, but it really highlights what happened in finding costs. In old technologies, we would basically drill a wildcat, find it was success, and then we'd start staking out the field. And unfortunately, we'd only know where we'd gone beyond the field when we had a dry hole. My imaginary example here was that we drilled 10 wells, 1 was the wildcat, 5 were appraisal wells, and 4 were dry holes. And so we spent $100 million on our finding. New technology, if we're lucky, a wildcat does it. If we're unlucky, we drill maybe 2 appraisal wells. So now we have a $30 million finding cost. And so in theory, we reduced our finding cost by 70%. And then development costs all get capitalized. And technology allowed us to basically go from 2 fixed platforms at $600 million each to 1 fixed platform and 10 subsea wells. And so we've actually reduced the cost from 1.2 to $900 million. But now we're not quite as sure exactly how many reserves we have, and so it becomes convenient to assume that instead of 100, let's use 120. And so we reduce our cost per barrel from 6 to 450. What we really don't know, and won't know until the end days of this field, is do we need more wells, and did we really have 100 or 120? This is what technology is yet to address. The underbelly of technology, which was phenomenal, was that we created a new term that I created as I did this, Frankensteinian decline rates. Oil and gas technology decline rates with old technology were modest, 5 to 10% per year. Giant oil and gas fields would produce for years without any decline at all. And the 1990s technology created a decline curve that had never been seen before. These declines created an exponential treadmill to drill more and more wells. Discoveries also shrank in size. And to economically produce small fields, all barrels needed to come out at once. And lack of depletion data kept this critical issue in a fog of war. In a word, when we thought we were on the verge of a glut, we were actually running closer and closer to the edge of peaking. By 2003, the depletion fog is starting to lift. Vintage by vintage, natural gas declines in the United States and Canada rates have soared. North Sea giant fields as recently as 1990-1995 shrank to midgets by 2003. A terminology I heard at an oil and gas conference a few weeks ago was that these new fields come and go so fast you hardly know them before they're gone. The fast decline rates are actually now masked by satellite fields that quickly move into existing production hubs when they start to decline, but satellite fields deplete even faster. And in a decade where almost everyone increased reserves, few increased production. And by the 21st century's start, non-OPEC supply, excluding the former Soviet Union, started to flatten out. Let me give you a quick primer on oil and gas depletion. It's the lack of any good data is why so many know so little. Public company data on depletion rates is almost non-existent, and OPEC data is locked in the safe. When fields begin to decline, that's when spending and remedial actions rise exponentially. The only good public data is what we see on net decline after all the steps to prevent decline happen. Large fields can postpone decline rates for a long period of time. Small fields have to create blowout depletion to become economical. As far as anyone knows that's ever studied it, all fields will ultimately peak and start to decline. So far, all fields seem to be finally peaking and now beginning to decline, because depletion to oil and gas is like taxes and dying. It happens to the best of them. Let me give you a handful of depletion examples. Here's the production profile from the last two supergiant fields ever found, ironically found within 12 months of each other, Prudhoe Bay and Sam Latar. Ironically, they were also found about the same place, just over the globe from one another. It turns out both had about 15 to 20 billion barrels of oil to recover. One turned out to be produced world-class. They carefully decided where to put a pin in the map and say we will not produce more than that, 1.5 million barrels a day. And so from 1977 until 1989, Prudhoe Bay had no decline. But when it finally rolled over, it started down. Its number of wells completed grew exponentially, and it now is about 350 to 400,000 barrels a day when you strip the satellites out, closer to 350. Sam Latar, same size field. They never choked it back. In fact, they did blowout prevention. They started water flooding the field, and at its peak, it accounted for almost 3.5 million barrels a day of the former Soviet Union's 12 million barrels a day. And when it came down fast as can be. Ironically today, Sam Latar and Prudhoe Bay are about the same size. One was a person that kept real good care of his body. The other lived a hard life, but now they're both old men. Here's the Forties field from 1990 on. The Forties field in the early 80s peaked at 500,000 barrels a day. It was one of the three giant fields in the North Sea that actually hit 500,000 barrels a day. By 1990, it was 190,000 barrels a day. By the time BP sold the field to Apache, it was down to 48,000 barrels a day. And here basically is the vintage of natural gas over the decade of the 90s. You see at the start of the 90s the gradual, gentle decline rates that the industry had come to expect. And by the end of the 90s, the decline rates start to resemble Niagara Falls. Let me give you a Frankensteinian decline story that involves the state of Texas. A year ago, our firm conducted a study, an intense study, of 53 counties in the state of Texas that account for about half of our natural gas. We were looking for the presence of marginal wells that might have been drilled in profusion, which resulted in a drilling boom that basically didn't produce any incremental supply. What we instead found was pretty interesting. It turns out that in this 53 county sample, 37,000 individual wells, that the freshman class, the wells completed in 2001, created 30% of January 2002 supply, 2,400 wells. We also found that 7% of the freshman class created essentially 50% of the supply. So 7% of the wells create half, the other 93% of the wells create the other half. We went back a few weeks ago and tested the same 53 county population for January 2003. We found, not surprisingly, that the new freshman class created 31% of all wells. And the 167 giant wells of the freshman class of last year that are now sophomores had declined by 82%. We also found that 7% of the 2002 wells created 49% of 2003 production, and the other 93% made up the balance. What's so important about this is that we now have this natural gas industry where you have to do two things at once. Drill all these little residue wells in profusion and make sure you always drill these unbelievably expensive giant wells because they decline by, at least in this example, 82% over the course of 12 months. If you go back to global oil, it's also illuminating to look and see what's exactly happened in non-OPEC oil supply over this fabulous last decade. It turns out that in total, non-OPEC supply was 40.2 million barrels a day in 1991. 5 years later, it was 41.3, and 5 years later, it was 45. But it's a classic tale of two cities, because the former Soviet Union was up and went down and came halfway up, and the rest of non-OPEC had a spurt in the first 5 years of 4.4 million barrels a day, and then basically, ironically, produced just half that in the next 5 years. And what's interesting is that 75% of the major gain came from the countries that are now clearly in decline. And so it would appear that, with the exception of the FSU, that non-OPEC supply around most of the rest of the globe is starting to flatten out. It turns out that non-OPEC supply basically also just grew by trickles. If you basically exclude Brazil and exclude Norway and exclude the UK in the first 5 years, almost all the incremental growth came 100,000 barrels a day here, 80,000 barrels a day there, 150,000 barrels a day there. Here are the four best estimates for non-OPEC growth between 2001 and 2003. The former Soviet Union, 60% of the growth, and not a single other country makes up over 100,000 barrels a day per year. The former Soviet Union turned out to be the last miracle supply growth of the last decade. What's so interesting, though, was it came out of the blue and unplanned. No one was counting on it. After a decade-long collapse, former Soviet Union supply began to grow again, and between 1999 and 2002, it grew by 2.4 million barrels a day. By 2003 fourth quarter peak, we're forecast at another 400,000 barrels a day. But the big question about this growth is several. First, are the numbers real? There are no API or EIA in Russia. What we're relying on is the numbers by 10 new publicly traded companies. 2, are the gains sustainable or one-time fix? 3, when will any new field development begin? Because so far, there's almost no new field development underway in the former Soviet Union. And 4, why is it that year after year, season after season, even when the Baltic's frozen in, even when the Black Sea's closed, exports from the former Soviet Union always seem to grow, unless some of the numbers aren't real? So it would appear to me that OPEC seems to hold all the future oil keys. Because if non-OPEC oil supply is flattening out, then the incremental growth is now entirely in OPEC's court. How robust each country's resources are, though, is unclear. The only thing we do know is that OPEC's fields were all discovered years ago, and a handful of giant fields create the bulk of our energy supply. Here's an interesting scattergram about who owns the oil by reserves. And it's interesting, 8 fields out of 20,000 still account for 20% of our reserves. Where are they? Well, basically the Middle East still dominates. Here's a little bit more relevant study because these aren't reserves now. This is actually daily production. It turns out that the world's 14 largest giant oil fields still account for 20% of our supply. And they start out with the largest on this side, Ghawar, and they go to the smallest, Rumaila South in Iraq. Turns out that these 14 fields have an average age of 46 years old. There are only 3 that were basically discovered in the 1970s. There are none that were discovered after 1976. Turns out the newest field of the group turns out to be a fairly small offshore field in Iran, and the second newest field in the group is the last oil field ever discovered to cross 1 million barrels a day, Cantarell, discovered in 1976. It's so old now, though, that Mexico spent $10.5 billion on a nitrogen injection program to halt its production decline. Let me turn briefly to natural gas, because all of the future demand forecasts show that natural gas growth will outpace oil by at least 1.5 times. The natural gas picture is hopefully so different than oil that the issues change. Many experts assume that natural gas will be the energy of first choice throughout the 20th century. And stranded gas, a term that basically means there's no way to sell it if it were produced, is prolific. Gas use there has barely begun, and if oil growth is waning, thank heavens for natural gas. But could this view be as wrong as the oil views were? Natural gas producers are a very different set of players. Here are basically the countries that are big players in natural gas. And the thing that strikes me when I look at this is look at the dominance of the U.S. and Russia. Look how small number 3 producer shrinks to, Canada. Look how tiny the United Kingdom is, number 4. And then look how absolutely tiny countries like Norway. Qatar, for instance, doesn't even make the list because it's just barely beginning to produce natural gas. What worries me about the future of natural gas is that the top 4 gas producers all might be in decline. The United States, categorically. Russia, categorically. Canada, probably. The UK, categorically. In the next 10, the Netherlands, yes. Indonesia, probably. Norway, not yet, but wait till next year. How are we so sure that the U.S. has peaked, or why am I so sure that the U.S. has peaked? Well, first of all, supply has been flat for a decade. We've done miracles. We went through a drilling boom, and all we could do is stay flat. But it turns out that the flatness masked an enormously significant growth in coal bed methane, in tight sands, in associated deep water gas, in deep formation, multiple zone giant gas wells. None of these were conventional natural gas. When you strip these additions out, you all of a sudden start to see quite a startling picture. Conventional natural gas in the United States as we know it today would appear to have peaked in the middle to early 1990s, just exactly like oil peaked 30 years ago. Why am I so sure Russia's in decline? Russia has 3 giant gas fields that make up 70 to 80% of their production base, and all are in steep decline. Gazprom is heavily in debt. It's already spent its next decade production. The take-or-pay contracts from Europe were basically borrowed against and spent to keep the company afloat. The Siberian pipeline alone needs $70 to $90 billion for, quote, maintenance. And new gas fields in Siberia seem to cost somewhere between $20 and $80 billion apiece. Here's the production declines from Urengoy, which back about 8 years ago was 30 of the 50 BCF a day of Russia's production. Between Urengoy, Orenburg, Yamal, which is now just starting down in Medev, there is indications that maybe 85% of the Siberian production now is in serious decline. Can stranded gas overcome these declines? Since the world is long on stranded gas, do these declines even matter? Well, there's only a small amount of what we call stranded gas that's actually now flared. And a growing amount has a new customer, injecting the gas into producing oil fields. What worries me about stranded gas is that the majority of stranded gas reserves have never seen a drill bit. And until reserves see a drill bit, we really don't know as much about them as we think. Conventional gas is also getting some new customers. It now would appear that at least half and maybe all of the McKinsey Delta gas needs to basically be sent to grow Canada's heavy oil. A very large amount of Iranian offshore gas is now needed to prop up the 9 out of 10 Iranian fields that once produced 10 million barrels a day each that are now about 100,000. Saudi Arabian gas is all desperately needed to create electricity and water for Saudi Arabia's exploding population. And Norway's gas is increasingly needed for reinjection for oil, and most of it is yet to be discovered. LNG and gas to liquids both have limits to growth. LNG projects are not just a receiving terminal. If the United States makes the same mistake in LNG receiving terminals as we did in building power plants without a dedicated supply, we could be sorely disappointed. A real LNG project takes a gas field, a pipeline, a liquefaction plant, a minimum of 2 vessels, and a receiving terminal. And all-in costs are $3 to $10 billion. A half a BCF a day receiving terminal needs a dedicated billion-barrel of oil equivalent field to support it if it's going to be amortized over 30 years. And gas to liquids, as we know it today, is still very expensive and extremely energy intensive. So we get back finally to the promised land, the Middle East. The Middle East is the energy promised land. All roads lead to Rome, and for the future in oil and gas, Rome is the Middle East. Abundant reserves, cheap to produce, still extremely unexplored, and if the rest of the world's long in the tooth, Thank Allah for Mecca, if we're sure this is right. The Middle East is not all oil and gas. First of all, is not all over the Middle East. The Middle East covers an enormous landmass. If you put the Middle East in the United States, it would include Texas to Minnesota, Ohio to Nebraska. If you put all the oil and gas as we know it today into a triangle, a golden triangle, it turns out within this triangle you have all the great fields that were ever found, and they all were found a long time ago. In the past 3 decades, exploration success throughout the Middle East has been modest at best. Is this because no one looked very hard, or because there was not much else to find? The French Petroleum Institute has a famous thesis that you can examine any basis, and for the first 5 years you drill dry holes, and then finally you find a knight. And with a handful of years you find the queen, and then right after the queen you find the king. And then in the next 10 to 20 years you find the rest of the knights. And after that there are no more knights. You're down to the serfs. Could this be the Middle East? Here's the Golden Triangle that basically starts at Kirkuk in the north and goes down and captures all of the Iranian oil fields and stops at the UAE and comes across and then goes right back up the other side, catching Ghawar, the largest oil field in the world, Rumelia, right back up to Kirkuk. If you superimpose the Golden Triangle on a part of the world I know well, Arizona and Utah, where I grew up, the base starts at the bottom of Arizona and reaches just at the bottom of where Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho come together. Not a very large area where all of the oils turned out to be found. And it turns out that the key Middle East producers all have one standard characteristic. They have a handful of fields that produces almost everything they have. Except Saudi Arabia, none of these fields have any excess capacity. Iraq's 2 primary fields are in despicable shape. Kuwait's prime fields have peaked. Iran only has 1 great field left. The UAE wants to sell its crown jewels, 28% of Upper Zakum, in return for some water handling expertise. Luckily, Saudi Arabia has endless and limitless oil. Are we sure this is true? Saudi Arabia's oil and gas challenges are as follows. There have been no major oil and gas exploration successes of any significance since the 1960s. Shaiba, newest field in the Middle East to come on in 1999, was discovered in 1963. Almost all of Saudi's production comes from very old fields, and almost every field has high and rising water cut. Ghawar, the world's largest oil field, injects 7 million barrels a day of seawater to pop up its reservoir pressures. And outside of North Ghawar, the top 20 miles, they have never found any sort of form of consistent porosity or permeability to replicate this bottom. I showed you the Golden Triangle. If you drew a box around all of the light oil fields of Saudi Arabia and superimpose them back on that territory, they would conveniently fit within the Great Salt Lake. Some of the key fields in Saudi Arabia never worked, and others are now watering out. And so it now takes fuzzy logic to plan for Saudi Arabia's future. What Saudi Arabia's real energy cost might be is still cloaked in great secrecy, but Saudi Arabia is categorically, in my opinion, no longer a low oil cost producer. Its lifting costs must be rising exponentially. You don't handle 7 million barrels a day of seawater without your lifting costs going way up. Natural gas finding costs are extremely high, and its dry holes trying to find natural gas have been higher than most would think. And so what's the right price for Saudi Arabian oil? I don't think we have any idea. But all I know is with this country that basically has 24 million people going to 40 million, its social costs are also going to rise. Which finally brings me to the question of the day. Could global oil now be nearing a peak? Well, the consensus of the world's group of energy economists is categorically no. Shell and BP's view of the future to 2020, 2030 is that we will have no supply constraints. But there are a band of scientists, physical scientists, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Lahair, Dr. Ali Bakhtiari, Dr. Ivanhoe, Dr. Giannassini, Dr. Youngquist, that basically all argue that the day of peaking is near at hand. They just don't know the date. None of these have any hard numbers to prove a date. Unfortunately, they're all working with this resource issue that's so hard to define. None argue, not a single one of them argue, that the world is about to run out of oil. But they all worry that conventional oil is either now peaking or is soon to peak. If Saudi Arabia's oil supply is peaking, then so is the world's. While unclear, it is not certain that Saudi Arabia is now not nearing its peak supply. Given high decline rates in too many other areas, if Saudi Arabia has peaked, then I would argue so has the world. But peaking does not mean that we have run out of oil. Peaking usually means supply soon declines. Peaking of oil and gas has always come as a surprise. While peaking is as common as people growing old, its arrival is rarely planned. The biggest peaking events have always been the biggest surprises. Dr. Hubbard's prediction in 1956 that the U.S. oil would peak in the early 70s, and he was right. Simmons and Company calling for a peaking of the North Sea in 1997 to 2000. Sadly, we were right. U.S. natural gas, 2002. It was predictable. Those who warned of the event were accused of crying wolf, but sadly, the wolf was real. There are ways to stem declines. Once oil provinces decline, drilling needs to accelerate at an ever steadier rate. The cost to maintain flat production also soars. Unless these actions occur, declines soon accelerate. To make these corrective steps, drilling has to soar. But there are limits to growth. A lack of spare rigs, rebuilding 400 old offshore rigs, a graying number of experts, and no freshman class. If oil and gas cannot carry the day, there is no scenario plan or trap door if oil and gas peak. But the world has to have more energy. The world has to have more energy. If the world runs short of oil and gas, the future could be quite ugly. Our energy challenges are real and are here. Could the single biggest future challenge on Earth be creating a new realm of energy? If so, where should the problem be solved? Houston, as the global energy capital, needs to rise to the cause. The Baker Institute and Rice University are logical leaders. John F. Kennedy came to Rice University in 1961 to challenge man to the moon. The Baker Institute, anchored in its understanding of interrelationships between politics, economics, and physics of energy, creates the same stage today. The challenge is awesome. The rewards for winning are even bigger. Thank you.
To stay on schedule because one of our speakers is going to be going to the airport later in the afternoon. So I'm going to go right to the presentation by Fareed Mohammadi. It's a pleasure to have Fareed here today to address our group. Fareed and I worked together for about 12 years back in the old days before I was an academic. And he is one of the leading commentators in the world about OPEC. Attends the OPEC meetings, knows all the OPEC ministers, provides on a consulting basis one of the premier services on the energy market, and he will be talking to us today on the geopolitics of oil.
All this oil, doom and gloom on the future of oil and this exciting talk about nanotechnology, I was inspired by Dr. Smalley's call for new students to go into and study this nanotechnology. And then I assessed my brain power. That was one, and that discouraged me. And secondly, I realized that I think I still should keep my day job because I think the geopolitics of oil is still going to be playing around for the next decade or so at least. And so I think I'll stick around and try to analyze that at least for another 10 years. Following the 1990 Gulf War, the debt crisis of the 1980s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is about as happened around the time that this institute was started. And I think Amy will remember some of our optimistic talk in those days. A lot of profound changes were predicted for the geopolitics of energy. The end of resource nationalism and the hope that vast regions of the world would be opened up and open up to international oil and gas companies, which would then lead to rising supplies and falling prices. And these two expectations, it was hoped, would be complemented with deregulation in the gas and power, which would bring cheaper and more efficient produced resources to both consumers and industry. looking at it from our perspective right now, I would say that not all of these have totally materialized, to put out an understatement. Yes, some new areas did open up. The global industry, though more concentrated at the top, still has thousands of companies competing for resources. And the deregulation, liberalization policies of the last decade did have an impact and did, to some extent, bear fruit in some areas. But one can say very much that the last 10 years, status quo producers, mainly OPEC, and specifically in the Persian Gulf, were able to protect their control over much of the oil markets. And although at times, especially in the mid-90s and early 90s, it seemed a bit less than perfect. Old-style resource nationalism tended to disappear, but new indigenous players, the national oil companies, and new national private companies succeeded in checking external competition. For the first time in the oil and gas history also, in the last decade, consumers, namely the US and then the UN, of course, did mount effective consumer boycotts of major producing countries for political reasons without worrying about supplies. And finally, gas and power companies, many of them, could not make it in this brave new deregulated world and largely failed to make and create efficient and stable markets. Some went into extracurricular activities. Others, of course, ran away from this market as the financial markets pushed them out. So will the next 10 years see more of the same? Well, I think to assess that, we really have to go to the three major events that have taken place lately. One is the impact of 9/11 especially on the status of Saudi Arabia as the US's key strategic partner in a sense in ensuring the orderly oil markets. The second, of course, is the impact of the US invasion of Iraq and its potential for opening up a large oil and gas province. And third, the recent volatility in gas prices in the US and the coming gas supply crunch, which was in a way talked about earlier. I'm going to go through, focus on oil and gas and talk about the OPEC system, supply management and prices, the implications of the US invasion of Iraq, some longer-term issues related to the development of adequate oil supplies and access issues mainly, and finally meeting US gas demand, a short discussion of that. Why did we have, in my opinion, from a geopolitical and political sense, such an unprecedented OPEC cohesion since 1999, when you really, for much of the decade, saw rising prices after 1995, but then a drop in 98 because of the Asian crisis, and particularly different scenario after what you saw in the very tumultuous 1980s. I think basically, apart from the election of Chavez, which brought back Venezuela into the OPEC fold, and because of some of the problems of the Oil for Food program, I think the core issue was, and still is very much prevalent, is the creation of what we in PFC Energy call the Riyadh Entente, which started in the mid-1990s, but really took shape from 99 onwards. And it was basically the triangle of Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Iran, but mainly Saudi Arabia and Iran as the key relationship that developed. And that provided, apart from the geopolitical issues of trying to find a common solution to Iraq, as the perception was back then, that the US handling of Iraq was creating too many problems on the ground for the populations in their countries, and also as a way to, in a sense, guard against the growing ties between Israel and Turkey. This creation of this regional relationship then translated into a more effective working relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia over how to manage the oil markets. It also coincided with a new strategic plan set up by Crown Prince Abdullah in the mid-1990s when he effectively gained power. King Fahd got ill. He started to control the reins of power, and he completely flipped the priorities of the Saudi regime. Number one, they had gone through from the early, well, basically from 1986, massive financial crisis where they ran up nearly $100 billion in debt and ran down $100 billion in foreign assets. He flipped it around from Fahd, who was very much obsessed with being America's best friend in the region. When the phone call came from Washington, Fahd would pick up the phone and say, yes, sir, we will reduce oil prices right away, immediately. And he flipped it around and said, we've got to debase the foreign policy issue, especially with the United States, and go to basics with now reforming our economy. And at the core of that was balancing books, and the core of balancing books was raising revenues. Now, cutting expenditures, and another aspect of it was the cutback in arms. And that also, to a certain extent, estranged the relationships with the United States. It was this core economic policy issue that ran Saudi Arabia and ran the strategy, was at the basis of King Fahad's Crown Prince Abdullah's strategy for the last few years, until 9/11. Now, 9/11 created a lot of problems for Saudi Arabia. And, well, namely that for the first time, everyone started to say, is this a reliable strategic partner? Are there 1,000 Osama bin Ladens in Riyadh? Are they all going to come and take over government, and then we're going to be held hostage? And especially if all our oil is now concentrated in Saudi Arabia. And this is the one thing that Riyadh, in the last 2-3 years, has really moved very aggressively to address. One, they want to ensure the U.S. sees Saudi Arabia again as a responsible partner. Two, they want to ensure that Saudi Arabia maintains its continued dominance in OPEC, both to show the U.S. that it can do fancy things in OPEC, but also to deal with the quote-unquote fear that is rising in the Gulf of a resurgent Iraq. Three, to ensure that the kingdom has the flexibility, political and economic, on the home front to adapt to a dynamic oil market. That means it can swing both ways, that at a particular time that it can trash prices. So, but does it have the financial resources for it? And that has also obsessed the kingdom. And finally, to ensure that the Al Saud family is seen as a stable and legitimate regime overseas, so that to portray the fact that there are not 1,000 Osama bin Laden sitting in Riyadh about to overthrow and take over this major source of oil. In general, this strategy of Crown Prince Abdullah from the OPEC point of view and from the Saudi Arabia point of view has been very successful. They have basically delivered to themselves and to the world, as they will argue, stable oil prices at a reasonable price. Average prices have been $25, $26 for the most part for the last few years. And that, they could argue, is help finance our books and also provide international oil companies with sufficient resources to carry on their business, and in a stable way. Now, if you deconstruct this by seasons, etc., and certain threats that the Saudis had to deal with and that the OPEC had to deal with, it's a little bit more wavy. But in the end, from 30,000 feet, this looks pretty stable. And in the last 3 months, what better, how more responsible OPEC and Saudi Arabia will argue is they have dealt with 3 huge stoppages. Number one, Venezuela, right in the Atlantic Basin, a major supplier of oil to the United States. The Saudis and OPEC were able to replace. Nigeria, a major producer of light sweet crude into the Atlantic Basin also, that was taken in stride, and the Saudis and OPEC members increased production and moderated the price increases. And then, of course, we had a full-blown shooting war in the middle of the heart of the Middle East, and the Saudis and OPEC dealt with that, is their argument. Basically, the Saudi production outside of Venezuela and Iraq increased 1.7 million barrels a day, and Saudi Arabia accounted for a 1 million barrel increase. And that is the whole notion of the Saudis want to show that they're responsible. Now, on the other side, they know what else is coming down the pike, and that is that these high oil prices have led to much higher non-OPEC supplies, and therefore management of the market going forward for them is going to be increasingly difficult. One is that the main issue is that Russia has been able to stabilize its economy, and Russian companies have been able to put some money back into the sector to raise output. And that now you're starting to see new oil coming from all sorts of strange places. While this year, the sentiment is that we've stabilized the oil markets yet once again, there's a growing sentiment within OPEC, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, because of the fear of Iraq, that the 2003 period may be the last period that oil prices could be kept at around $25 a barrel. Let's turn now very quickly to the issue of Iraq. In many ways, let's go back to a little bit of a pre-war issue and discussion, and let's go to a certain extent to U.S. intentions vis-a-vis Iraq. And was it, in fact, an oil war? Was this an attempt, and this is a great suspicion not on the peace movement, but also in the Gulf, that this was an attempt to, this was for oil, number one, for the oil companies, and number two, from the Gulf side and from the OPEC side, this was to grab oil and then flood the market and trash prices. I won't go too much into this in terms of was it an oil war, but suffice it to say, I think most would agree with me that the oil companies were not behind it.